Thank you very much, Dr. Nadir Hashimi, for very much comprehensive presentation on the relations of governance, different types of governance regimes, and how does it relate to the current pandemic situation of the spread of the virus COVID-19. Before we continue with opening up for a question and answer session, I would like to invite Dr. Ali Salman from Islam and Liberty Network to also contribute to our discussion today. I will just put Dr. Ali Salman talk. Dr. Ali Salman, are you there?
Yes, Hassan, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nadir Hashmi. It's a pleasure to again hear from you and see you actually speaking on this, of course, the most important topic. I think in my remarks, I was thinking that there is, on this topic, I broadly agree with Dr. Nadir Hashmi emphasis and the distinction between the authoritarian regimes and the democratic regimes. And I think his extension of the same hypothesis to the Muslim majority countries is also more or less, I think, agreeable. And so I would say broadly, I agree. And I can also cite a couple of examples, more positive examples, as like Dr. Nadir mentioned about Malaysia, also mentioned about Pakistan, Bangladesh. There are countries also like Tunisia, which have actually done quite well in terms of informing their public, and some of these countries like Malaysia and Tunisia have invested historically quite well in the public health systems. Mm-hmm. And I think that has also played a role in sort of maintaining a level of trust. Dr. Nadir Hashmi mentioned about trust a number of times today, which is very, very crucial in this day and age. So that kind of investment in the public health system has helped containing the crisis, I think, in some of these countries. And despite of the spread of infection, people have exhibited confidence in how government is responding. And on the other hand, in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where the sufficient investment in the healthcare system was not made over years, despite of the fact that they are functioning democracies, and I would say rather noisy democracies, we have not seen the same level of trust from the public. And one of the reasons that the reported cases of coronavirus and infection is low in these countries is obviously due to lack of trust of the public in these systems, in the systems which these countries have developed. There have been stories from my home country, Pakistan, that people are afraid of reporting because they have seen the conditions in the hospitals or heard of conditions of hospitals where they are subject to isolation. The conditions are not conducive, not healthy at all. And so they would rather not report themselves if there are any conditions they experience. So I think that the numbers can be misleading in the countries where the public health system is not sufficiently developed. So that is one point I would like to mention, that apart from the regime type, democracy versus authoritarianism, I think the quality of healthcare system has also impacted the number of reported cases and the level of controls. Give you another example is actually, if you just to sort of challenging this also hypothesis in the Gulf and also Saudi Arabia, in Gulf countries, where obviously we have, there are authoritarian regimes, or at least there is no democracy. But we have seen comparatively, I think, well-established public health systems in these countries, and these countries have taken reliable measures to contain the virus, to educate the people, to inform, to inform the public in general. And today, Dr. Nadir also emphasized on the importance of being truthful to your public. Information has to be shared transparently, which is so crucial. And I think in that respect also we see some good examples in these non-democratic Gulf countries, essentially because I think these countries are relatively more developed in terms of economic and economic infrastructure, economic growth, public health systems, and they can therefore, I think, afford to take these measures. So I would just like to, bring in this aspect in this hypothesis and maybe problematize it further. That maybe by looking at this aspect into the quality of the public health system, we can explore more dimensions. There's also this the other dimension of this topic. Today we have not discussed economy actually, because of course this is not the topic today. But towards the very end, Dr. Nadir mentioned about how marketization or privatization has also created a problem. And to this, I think I would offer a slight disagreement. And what I'm seeing is across the world and developing countries, developed countries, especially those countries which are very much dependent on trade. So Malaysia is a good example of a small open economy which is very much dependent on trade. These countries are going to suffer in the long term more due to the economic blockade imposed by the measures the government has taken in terms of restrictions on the supply chains, restrictions on movement, and this is something which we have not been able to comprehend so far. Governments all over the world are announcing stimulus packages, more intervention, heavy budgets, but this is linked back to the question of democracy, which Dr. Nadir mentioned, that actually this crisis has unfortunately given more opportunities to at least some type of government and some politicians, or most politicians perhaps, to expand their power. And this is going to be a problem not just for political and civil liberties. This is ultimately going to pose a challenge also in terms of economic liberties. And I was told yesterday this example. For instance, Malaysian government has imposed restrictions by saying that we will allow only essential goods or essential products to be in the market, and non-essential businesses should be closed down. But then this distinction between essential and non-essential is quite lost, in the sense that, for instance, a large multinational operating in production of food complained that we can continue to operate our factories, but then transport, packaging, which are now declared non-essential, are locked down. And so obviously they will also close down, which will lead to maybe a food shortage. I hope not, but maybe food shortage. It can happen in also other countries which are dependent on the flow of goods across borders and flow of goods within the borders. So what I'm saying is that I think by when we talk about the crisis and the role of the government in mitigating this crisis, we should also be watchful of how this crisis may lead to a greater presence of the government in the name of good, in the name of good intentions, but then ultimately it can also lead to a curtailment of our rights, and that is all interlinked. Ultimately, it will affect the quality of democracy. Ultimately, it will affect the quality of the rights we enjoy, and ultimately, it will also affect even the nature of the welfare regime or welfare systems that we ought to see in the world. So I think these were my couple of interjections. So first of all, as I mentioned, we need to bring in the investment in the healthcare system, perhaps, to see the differences, and secondly, to emphasize even more the importance of maintaining trade flows, supply chains in this moment of crisis, because ultimately the economic dimension is going to hit us even harder than the physical dimension of this crisis. Thank you. I look forward to more discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali Salman. Straight away, I'm looking into the questions being asked by the attendees. So far, there's 3 questions. I will start with the first question by Adriana to Dr. Nadir Hashimi. What is trending now is that there will be a new normal post-COVID-19. What do you envision this new normal to be? Currently, there are also issues faced by certain societies with no access to houses. How to stay home then, clean water, soap and food, for example, asylum seekers, refugees, etc. Because we understand that we cannot really say or foresee that how long would this crisis happen to be. And at the moment, there are certain segments of the communities that are facing even more difficulties by being in this control movement situation or in lockdowns in some countries. How do they sustain themselves economically, and how does this also relates to their own situation? Perhaps you can comment that, Dr. Nadir.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. It's a very good question that doesn't have an easy answer. I read a fascinating piece about a week ago in the context of social distancing. And someone made the observation that in the context of many developing societies around the world, this author was talking about India, she made the argument that social distancing is a luxury that most people in the developing world can't afford, because to social distance yourself or to stay at home for many people around the world means that their children don't eat food. And so for many countries, I think what's happening right now, this new normal, if you will, where we in the United States, just sort of stay at home and work on the internet, that's a function of, advanced economies with high levels of, economic production and higher, standards of living. But when you start thinking about the consequences of this pandemic in poor societies where people live, day to day, and they don't have the option of staying at home, then you're looking at, a catastrophe. Not just. I'm leaving the health consequences of the pandemic aside. I'm talking about economic activity, sort of the point that Ali was hinting at. People just can't stay at home. The broader point that was also mentioned is that, in broken societies, in crowded societies, in refugee camps. What does social distancing mean in the context of a Syrian refugee camp in Turkey or in Idlib province? There is no social distancing. So if the virus spreads there, that means that thousands of people will be vulnerable. So I think what we're seeing here, the point that I'm trying to convey, that we are just at the beginning of a potential global catastrophe. The tens of thousands of deaths that we're seeing in Europe now and in the United States is going to really pale in comparison if this virus spreads in large parts of Asia, large parts of Africa. And it's also going to have this, drastic economic effect where people are going to start to starve because they can't make a living anymore. There's no economic production and they can't feed their families. So this is going to put a huge, I think, burden on governments in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in India, Pakistan, in Egypt. I mean, Egypt has a population of 100 million people now. What happens when the virus spreads there? How long can people actually stay at home and quarantine themselves? A week, 2 weeks, but what happens after that? So I think, there's a lot to be concerned about here. And the prognosis, unfortunately, from my vantage point, does not look very good.
Mm-hmm. Going through next question. This one is question from Muhammad Rizwanul Haq. If it's just about regime type, what about poor democratic countries where the capability of the state, economic and health quality is not solid enough to deal with such a pandemic caused by an aggressively infectious pandemic? Because I can see that most of the government's response, including in Malaysia, when the situation of lockdowns or something like an emergency response situation is introducing with new, mainly economic packages. It's not just about dealing with the management of the healthcare situation of the pandemic, but also introducing some economic stimulus on how to maintain the economic situations to continue. But what about countries? If you could give some inputs on countries which is basically democratic countries, but without such economic strength and also public health management properly, how would you foresee situations in those countries?
Well, Rezman was my former student, and he's doing a PhD in Colorado at the University of Colorado. So thank him for his great question. It's a good one. I think the point to be made, though, is that, democracies are not monolithic. They're not all the same. Authoritarian regimes are not all the same. There is a variation. There is a spectrum. So I think fundamentally what Fukuyama was arguing is that state capacity, the capacity of the state to do the right thing during a moment of crisis, does fundamentally matter. But social trust also matters. And usually those societies that are democratic have higher levels of trust. You can have situations where you have sort of very weak democracies. And I'm not talking about democracies that simply have elections. My use of the term democracy is democracy at a much higher level, where you do have free and fair elections, but you also have an element of social justice and social redistribution. You have basically a social safety net. You have a public health policy. You have the capacity of the government to do things properly in the moment of a crisis. So many of the democracies that Rezwan was referring to, I think, are going to be very weak and unable to respond adequately, particularly if you're dealing with, huge populations with the absence of good public health policies in place and options for citizens. I mean, if sort of, take Indonesia. Okay, Indonesia is considered to be a democracy. It's got some problems in it, but it also has over 230 million people. What happens if the global pandemic hits, Indonesia really hard? Is Indonesia going to be able to respond effectively when you have, tens of thousands of people being contaminated, perhaps dying every single day? I mean, no country in the world will be able to have the health capacity to respond to that type of, crisis. So I think those countries are going to be in really difficult situations. But it's a good point. I think it forces us to sort of think about different types of democracy and different types of authoritarian regimes that are able to sort of respond to these particular global crises.
Mm-hmm. Moving to the next, there's another two questions here. First by Nagib Yunus, and second, which is remain anonymous. The topic, the questions that they are posing is how does it relate to the current situation with the main point which you addressed quite comprehensively during your earlier talk, which is about trust. And you addressed about the point on one of the key components of differences between an authoritarian regime and also and a system of governance which is more democratic is the capability when it comes to encouraging trust among the populations to the leadership. The first question puts into looking to a bit more specific when it comes to trust towards the governance, meaning to say that trust is not necessarily just towards a government as if it's a president or a prime minister, the top of leader of the country, but it is also about trust when it comes to the health institution or health as a system. I'm giving an example in the case of here in Malaysia. Almost every day, the director of the health will be the one briefing and updating on the current updates and the situations either of new infections or lives which have been caused due to the situation, instead of having a minister or having the prime minister to talk about the health issues. So on this matter, do you see that when it comes to dealing with specific issues which relates to health, which we may think that it is important to have someone who have that credibility from health expertise to brief and talk about this, or it is actually should be dealt by someone which is more having a national figure, meaning the leadership figure of a president or a prime minister or things like that?
Yeah, I think the second is much more preferable. So in Canada, for example, I mean, I was born in Canada and I have Canadian citizenship, so I follow the politics in Canada very carefully. What happens in Canada is the Prime Minister comes on every day and gives an update on what's happening, and then he turns over the microphone to the leading health specialist in the country to give an overview of what's happening, because there's a perception that because the Prime Minister comes from a political party, it's better that a leading health specialist who is beyond politics update the country on what's happening and sort of, you know, give advice on how to handle this particular moment of crisis. So the point about social trust during moments of pandemic fundamentally relies around the ability of a government to guide, to organize, and to mobilize society in the right direction, to follow a set of policies that will help resolve the crisis. If you have a government in power that lacks social trust, that is viewed as being corrupt or partisan or really caring about the interests of one segment of the country, one ethnic group, one religious group, then people are not going to listen to the advice and to the recommendations of that government. They're going to think that the government is lying, most likely because it has a track record of lying. You're not going to be able to do the things, particularly in terms of, you know, mass mobilization, to observe social distancing, to stay at home, and to, you know, follow a game plan, a strategic game plan that can get you through this crisis. So I think very much that's the relationship between trust, government, and pandemics. It's the ability, you know, to have that capacity for people to view the government and to believe that the government is following scientific data, it's pursuing policies in the best interest of everyone, not just the best interest of the people who support that prime minister or that president. And so that's why I think, you know, having some public health official who is not, you know, connected to any political party, being the lead spokesperson, updating the country, advising citizens on what to do, is the much better preferred option. You know, one of the problems that we're facing right now in the United States is you have Donald Trump, who is the president, who is, you know, he's half the country likes him, half the country hates him. Luckily, you know, you still have, and this is, I never thought I would praise Donald Trump, but I'm going to do it right now. He has organized a coronavirus task force, and he has two very prominent scientists and medical physicians who come every day to the press briefings and answer questions. Dr. Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, who are, you know, world experts in the field, and they're the ones who are sort of informing the president. And when they speak with a sense of authority, honesty, integrity that everyone in the United States, regardless of where they stand politically, tend to listen to those people because they are considered to be, you know, nonpartisan experts.
Interesting input on that one, because it shows that when it comes to, it's not just about governance in the sense of democratic or authoritarian government, but it also shows that in such situation, new levels of authorities responds in different ways, in the sense that expertise, medical experts now becomes authorities, and these are the one which could explains more about have more better social and public trust. I'm going to raise one question, mainly coming from my own interest, observing, at least based on some news reports in Malaysia, definitely, and also I think it's quite the same in some other countries as well, which is how does the our situation now on the virus COVID-19 is actually affecting, and it's also in some ways changing religion and public life. It is quite an important topic, especially in the case of Malaysia, because one of the main outbreak clusters, which is in Malaysia, is mainly associated to religious activities. Mainly, one of the main gathering by the Tabligh Jemaah movement, and that is being seen as one of the main cluster which come up, which have caused a lot of the spread of the virus. There's several implications or consequences have been caused by this. One of it is how we see that the responses from religious institutions or religious authorities on the matter in Malaysia, and not just that, and not just only that, but we could also sense some elements of stigmatization towards certain religious community groups because of they are being seen as causing issues and troubles. I don't want to go towards that part of the discussion, but based on several reports, I also noticed that it is not only the case of Malaysia. In several other countries as well, there's very much a close relations between the situation of the virus and how is it also affects other religious communities, Christian communities mainly in Europe and also in America, in India as well. And going back to the situation in Malaysia, at least to me, it is something like it is an untested situation before. How would religious communities respond to such situation? And effectively now, Friday prayers are almost in a situation it is no longer being allowed to do Friday prayers. There are several communities, members of the communities, some of them were arrested because of attending Friday prayers. And Islamic authorities, mainly the leaders of the Islamic departments, comes up with statements on how do Muslim communities need to respond to this situation. And it also relates to some changes in terms of how do you want to do your adhan, you're calling for prayers and encouraging more of doing prayers at home. Looking into this relation between the spread of the virus and the threat to the community, while at the same time looking into another part of an important principle of democracy itself, which is religious freedom. How do you find the situation about whether do you find some contradiction in this situation, and how do you see what is the best way to accommodate these differences?
No, it's a very good question, and we're seeing this play out before our eyes. Governments now, generally speaking, have tried to, advise their citizens not to gather in public places. In many places, Jummah prayer have been canceled. I predict very soon that Hajj this year will be canceled. Yeah. But what you see is a dichotomy between what official state government officials are saying about religious practice in public, and then what individual Muslim groups, leaders, imams are saying to their own supporters. And in many ways, these two groups are talking at cross purposes. This is not unique to Islam. You can read what's happening right now in Israel, where these ultra-Orthodox groups are not listening to government guidelines, and they're just going to their religious places because they cannot conceive of daily existence without practicing their religion. This is in many ways a global problem. More so, historically speaking, not just in the Muslim world, but in traditional societies everywhere, during moments of great crises, of pandemics, people naturally flock to religious places, shrines, mosques for prayer, seeking God's support and sustenance during this calamity. When you can't do that, culturally speaking, it poses a problem for many people. And I don't think there's any easy sort of solution here. I mean, you can't physically arrest hundreds of thousands of members of the Tabligh Jamaat in Malaysia or in Pakistan and say you can't gather anymore. All you can do is try and meet with the senior leadership of these groups, try to sort of convince them that what they are doing is putting in jeopardy the lives of their own supporters and putting in jeopardy the global public health of everyone else in society. So this is one of these unique moments that we really haven't faced, at least not in my memory, where you have an emergency crisis on your hands, where the normal routine, the normal religious practices that we have gotten used to, going to Hajj, Friday prayer, gathering in mosques, all of those things, in the name of public health, in the name of keeping people alive, have to be completely rethought. And all you can do is try and persuade people. If you try and I think use physical force, that creates a lot of other problems. I think, if I was advising the government, I would advise them to try and meet with these religious leaders who have influence over their followers and to try and sort of convince them that their attempt to gather in public places and to ignore these guidelines is creating a catastrophe. Now, of course, one of the problems that we're seeing, and I followed this event, a little bit because it's in the news and it relates to this question of social trust, transparency, and democracy. Many people in many parts of the Muslim world don't believe there really is a coronavirus crisis. They think it's a conspiracy. They think it's, a concoction. It's an American sort of, problem that they've sort of developed. And so, when some people, not all of them, but many traditional people, when they're, told about this virus, it raises doubts in their mind because they're living in authoritarian systems where they're surrounded by lies all the time. And again, we see one of the negative consequences here of authoritarian regimes. When you consistently lie and deceive and you don't tell the truth, then during a moment of pandemics, when you need people to rely on the truth, they don't believe you. So this is sort of one of the unintended consequences of the legacy of authoritarianism that we're seeing today in parts of the Islamic world.
Okay, at the moment, I haven't received any new questions, but I'm going to touch on one point which I've also raised earlier about no one really knows how long would this situation remain and whether it would continue for a longer term. Most reports which I've read online tends to say that it could take quite a long time because there's no guarantee that the vaccine can be developed within a short time, and there are various possible situations that could happen in the future. And one thing which is not being totally sidelined is that generally most societies would need to adapt to this situation of social distancing, control of movement for quite a longer period. And as Ali Salman also already mentioned, in part of his concern is also what comes to the future of the economy. And as you have also mentioned earlier about the future of democracy itself. If we try to see the situations going to continue for a more longer term, in some ways it also relates to we need to kind of accept the situation that the situation of freedom, liberty, and democratic rights may not necessarily be the same as before the spread of the pandemic. So looking into such situation, one thing is for citizens, for people, how do we need to adapt with the situation while at the same time emphasizing on the importance of democratic rights and the basic civil liberties, while at the same time, how do mainly democracy advocates should respond to this if you are thinking about the situation could be happening in a longer run? You know, is it just we say that, okay, it is a time for definite compromise, or that we need to rethink about how do we actually promote democracy in such situation, especially in preparing for if things could happen again in the future, besides then the situation of COVID-19?
Yeah. No, those are good questions. You're right that the predictions are that this crisis is not going to end anytime soon. And even if the numbers start going down, the predictions are that there might be multiple waves of this coronavirus coming back. And until we get a vaccine, this could last for many months. If not, it could be cyclical until next year. So how do you respond? How do democracies respond in this particular moment? How do citizens respond at this particular moment of crisis? I think if governments try to consolidate power, try to roll back rights, try to postpone elections, try to invoke emergency sort of procedures claiming that we have a national crisis and we can't have elections anymore, or we can't have debates anymore, or we can't have a free press anymore, then I think citizens have to fight back. Now, if you get a situation where there is calamity and catastrophe, where thousands of people are dying every week, when things are really catastrophic, then I could understand that during those unique moments, when you have, when you have hundreds of thousands of people whose lives are on the line and who might be dying, I can understand emergency procedures taking place during those unique moments. But I think there are ways of handling those crisis moments by insisting on regular intervals of review, of accountability, to not allow this to just drag on forever. But let's say a government wants to sort of use emergency powers to deal with a crisis, it has to be for a limited period of time. It has to be subject to parliamentary review. It has to be subject to some sort of checks and balances. It just can't be what we're seeing today in Hungary or what we're seeing today in Cambodia, where a government says, look, I just want all the power and I'm going to use it, and there's no limits or checks or balances. So I think one has to be very careful to not let the little democracy that we have in various Muslim societies slip away, and allow governments to manipulate this moment to consolidate power, because this is a perfect opportunity for those authoritarian leaders, political parties, to manipulate this moment to consolidate power in the name of a national emergency, but really with the goal of trying to preserve their own political careers. So one has to be very vigilant and very careful. I think it's also an opportunity for democracy. And it's an opportunity for democracy in the sense that, the way that countries are going to manage this moment of the pandemic is by having, what Ali mentioned, good public health investments, procedures, options for citizens. Societies that I think have invested in those things are going to be able to manage this crisis better than others. And that demands, accountability from government, resources developed to make sure that people can have the access to healthcare that they need in many parts of the Islamic world. In many ways, I think Malaysia, I don't know the state of healthcare in Malaysia, I think it's probably much better than other parts of the Islamic world, but in large parts of Africa, large parts of, Pakistan, Egypt, where you have huge populations and you have corrupt, governments, you're not going to have the health options that you need. And so that can be a demand for citizens to sort of insist that any future government worry about providing basic health care for its citizens. And that could be part of the democratic demands and the democratic sort of goals that citizens should be aspiring for in the context of their own struggles for democracy.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nadir. Just before we finish off our discussion for today, I will invite again Ali Salman to, is Ali still here?
So I thought I have already offered my remarks earlier on in response to Dr. Nadir's excellent commentary.
Then, yeah?
They were very good remarks. Very good remarks, Ali.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I appreciate the fact that today in today's discussion we were able to actually take a broader view of how different governments are responding to this crisis. And this is important to reflect on the long-term implications. I think today's discussion is more futuristic in nature. I mean, of course, the health authorities all over the world are scrambling to mitigate this crisis, to minimize the public health losses, to minimize the life losses. But it is important that at the same time, academics and think tanks all over the world also keep on reflecting on the developments as they take place, and draw lessons for our governance at large, and draw lessons for globalization, draw lessons also for the both political system as well as the economic systems. So I think I really appreciate today's presentation by Dr. Nadir, and also the question and answer, and also Ehsan for bringing kind of a huge variety of issues in which we were able to cover politics, but also healthcare, and also personal liberties, including religious liberties. It is indeed a very, very complex challenge, and as Dr. Nadir mentioned in the start of the presentation, I think it is probably the biggest crisis that we are witnessing, definitely in our lifetime, and also in last several decades at the global level. So I guess at this point, we hope to continue to reflect on the long-term dimensions of this crisis, and be engaged broadly with public and also with the policy audience. Thank you so much, Dr. Nadir, and thank you, Ehsan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali Salman. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadir Hashimi. Thank you very much to all attendees who participated and posed questions for our discussion. One thing for sure is that the conversations on how discussions about democracy and the situation of our world will continue, including in Malaysia as well. And as for the current moments, that as we are also adapting to new situations of the crises, I would think that if new programs will be organized through using the online medium instead, we are also adapting to such situation as well. While we keep on the conversation going, just to make sure that I wish you all to be safe and to be healthy as well, Dr. Nadir and other attendees, and look forward that we can have another discussion again on a relevant topic, perhaps in the coming few weeks. Yeah. Okay. All the best, and best wishes to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Stay safe. Assalamu alaikum. Stay safe. Thank you.